My dear students, welcome to this massive open online course on Development Economics 2. Today we shall discuss economics and politics of multilateral trade. This is the first part of the discussion. And after the completion of this module, you will be acquainted with the evolution of the goals of multilateral trade and the strategies to be followed in attaining that particular goal. You can understand the rationale behind this multilateral trade policy, and you will be capable of identifying the deviation from this strategy in the trade policy. First, we must understand what is multilateralism. Multilateralism actually implies the trade between nations with least barriers, upon trade in terms of tariff barrier or non-tariff barrier. That means multilateralism means when there are several countries should be involved in that international trade process, and they must exchange the commodities, the services, with least hindrance upon the process of that transaction. From the early days of the Silk Road to the creation of the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, which we call as GATT, and the birth of World Trade Organization, namely WTO, trade has always played an important role in supporting the economic development and promoting the peaceful relations among the nations. The global rules that underpin our multilateral economic system were the outcome of the Second World War. Because during the Second World War, different countries were affected, and all of these countries who were involved in that great war, they were desperately searching out the way through which they can again regain their power, the lost economic health. And they thought that unhindered process of trade, global trade, can help them in gaining that lost economic health. Therefore, they proposed, they favored, they emphasized on that multilateral trade. And this year, 2023, it marks the 75th anniversary of the operation of that multilateralism, which was started by the establishment of GATT, the signing of the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade in January 1948. And it was later on, it was superseded by WTO. On 30th October 1947, GATT was signed. General Agreement on Tariff and Trade was signed by 23 countries. Out of 23, 12 were developed countries and 11 were developing countries. And India was one of the signatories among that developing countries in 1947. In 1946, just 1 year before, the newly created Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, they called a conference to consider the creation of International Trade Organization, ITO. Actually, ultimately, ITO could not be formed, but that was the proposal from the United Nations that one international organization named as ITO, International Trade Organization, should be formed, and it was considered as the triad of other two. Other two were International Monetary Fund and International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, which we commonly call as World Bank. Actually, the objective was that if any country, say it is confronted with short-term crisis, balance of payments crisis or external payments crisis, then IMF will help those countries. If any country suffers from long-term, say, structural problem, long-term problem of growth, then World Bank will assist those countries with financial help so as to gain their strength, financial, economic, infrastructural strength so as to attain the long-term growth. And this International Trade Organization will be another international institution that will facilitate the international trade without any barrier. A preparatory committee was formed to just prepare the draft of ITO, that is what should be the form of ITO, International Trade Organization. And during 1946-47, that committee started working, and before the establishment of ITO, the negotiating countries, they first started with a tariff cut, okay? 45,000 tariff concessions, okay, affecting about 10 billion US dollar were already actually they made this type of concessions. So the objective was, if each country can reduce the import tariff, then the trade can flow much more easily between nations. That was the objective. So with this objective in mind, on January 1st, 1948, GATT entered into force, okay? And each year, or in subsequent years, there was a conference among the countries which were the member countries of GATT. That conference is known as the Round. In 1949, we observed the second round of GATT conference, okay, that took place in France at NSA, okay, in that particular city. And during the second round of trade negotiations, we observed a tariff cut by about 5,000, it's a tariff concession. And in the third round also in 1950 of GATT round, which took place in England, in Torquay, we also observed there was a tariff concession to the tune of 8,700, okay? And that reduction was about 25% in relation to 1948 level. So what we observe? We observe that in each round, the member countries, they agreed to reduce the import tariff. The restrictions were reduced. In the fourth round, which took place at Geneva in 1956, that round produced some tariff reductions to the tune of 2.5 billion US dollar. Okay, and again in the subsequent round in the year 1960, which we call as Dillon round, named up in the honor of US Undersecretary of the State Douglas Dillon, who proposed these negotiations. Okay, that round also resulted in some tariff concession to the tune of 4,400 tariff concessions, covering about 4.9 billion US dollar. Okay, now every round you will observe tariff concession. Now, when you give concession, then actually you lose tariff revenue. If you reduce import tariff, then as a government you lose your revenue. But on the other hand, when you reduce the tariff, you add value to the trade flow. Okay, for example, if your collection reduces by 100 rupee, then that means alternatively your value of trade increases by 100 rupee. So the objective was to reduce the tariff to make the trade much more free. Okay, so free trade was the objective. In 1964 GATT round, which took place at Geneva, we observe a tariff concession process. But here, the process was a linear tariff cut as opposed to product by product tariff cut. For example, in the earlier rounds, they considered some product. For example, product X, there should be a tariff cut. Product Y, a tariff cut. But now, they considered the industrial products as a whole. And that is called a linear process of tariff cut. And that resulted in a tariff concession to the tune of 40 billion US dollar. In 1973 Tokyo round also, we observed a tariff concession to the tune of about 300 billion US dollar. Okay, as a result, what happened? The average tariff rate declined from 7% to 4.7%. So gradually, average tariff rate on merchandise product or industrial products, that reduced in the global trade. Okay, and as I have already indicated in my previous module, that in 1986, the GATT round is called as Uruguay Round, which took place in Uruguay, and it continued for 7 years. Round doesn't mean that you just sit for a conference and it ends within 1 hour. No. GATT round is such round, the round means subsequent conferences. It can go for years together. And 1986 conference, say it took 7.5 years, 7.7 years and 6 months to complete that process, and it ended in the year 1994. And what actually the theoretical underpinning of this tariff cut? Here I have used a simple model, okay, to explain this. Actually, when GATT suggested for a tariff negotiation, that means tariff cut. Actually, that is a supply side adjustment for facilitating multilateral trade. Why it is called supply side facility? Because if you consider the supply function, just think of a supply function. Supply of any commodity is a function of the price of the commodity, price of the factor used in that production, price, government tax policy, different independent variables are there. So if you consider that tax or the tariff is reduced, then what will happen? Consider this supply function S naught and the demand function, demand curve D naught. So what you get? You get the equilibrium price P naught and the equilibrium quantity Q naught. Now if the government reduces the tariff, what will happen? As the government reduces import tariff, the cost burden on the supplier will fall. So for supplying Q naught quantity, the producer, the seller, was ready to supply at a price P naught. But now when there is a tariff cut, he is ready to supply the same quantity at a reduced price P2. So P naught P2 is the amount of tariff per unit. Okay. So if there is a tariff cut, you can explain it in two ways. Same quantity can be supplied at a reduced price, or at the same price, the suppliers can supply more. So the supply schedule as a whole shifts to the right. Here in my diagram, the supply schedule shifts from S0 to S1. Now, given the demand schedule, D0, if there is a rightward shift in the supply schedule, what will happen? The equilibrium price will fall and equilibrium quantity will rise. So that is a benefit for the nation, for all the nations together. Because when you produce more at a reduced price, then the common people will get the benefit. You are supplying more. And if your utility, social utility, is a function of social consumption as a whole. So if you can create a situation, an environment where the people are getting more and more commodities, their choice will be open, and that will lead to higher social welfare. So the Uruguay round of GATT, what are the results? The result was an average tariff cut to the tune of 40% on industrial products, an average increase in the percentage of tariff binding. What is tariff binding? Tariff binding means you have, say, a basket of commodities that you trade. And what percentage of traded commodities, okay, you commit that you should not increase, the government will not increase the tariff rate beyond a limit. That is called tariff binding. For example, if you consider that out of my all traded commodities, 70% of the commodity I commit that my government will not increase the tariff rate beyond this limit. So that is called tariff binding. My commitment is I should not move beyond the bound. So what happened after the Uruguay round? It is observed that for developing countries, that tariff binding increased from 21% to 73%. What does it mean? It means that for developing countries, they are committed not to impose tariff beyond a limit for 73% of the traded goods. But for developed countries, it was 99%. For transitional economies, okay, middle income or upper middle income countries, that is 98%. So that means most of the countries are committed not to increase the tariff on import, okay, beyond the limit. And they also agreed to reduce the non-tariff barrier. What are the non-tariff barrier? For example, the quota restriction, quantity restrictions, okay, subsidy payment. Those non-tariff support or non-tariff barrier should also be minimized. That was the outcome of GATT. The next one is that agreement included services also in that trade norms. That means there should be an agreement, and that name of the agreement was GATS, G-A-T-S, General Agreement on Trade in Services. That means the countries should also withdraw restrictions on the service flow between nations. And intellectual property right was included. It is called as TRIPS, Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights. For example, you innovate something or you invent particular. For example, you invent a particular medicine with huge amount of R&D, and that should not be copied by some other country. So you must protect your intellectual property. So that is called intellectual property right. For example, different countries should adopt proper patent act, proper trademark act, industrial design to protect these they have to develop some rules and regulations. Okay, new rules were in favor of anti-dumping policy. Anti-dumping, what is dumping policy? If any country supplies huge amount of any commodity in other country, just to dump their product there, and that will lead to excess supply of that product in that country, and that will lead to a fall in the price, and they can attract the buyers in that particular country, and that is called a dumping policy. This should not be the policy of any particular country, so it is called anti-dumping policy. So GATT provision was very much strict about anti-dumping, and that led to the creation of the permanent body, World Trade Organization. Actually, what was the objective? What objective was to create ITO. ITO was not created. So in 1995, we observed the creation of WTO, World Trade Organization. What is the basic difference between GATT and WTO? GATT was an agreement, but WTO is a permanent body. Okay, they have dispute settlement department, and they can create some rules and regulations which every member country has to follow. Now, can you tell me any particular difference between GATT and WTO? Now, the basic pillars of this multilateral trade are three. Three pillars are non-discrimination, reciprocity, and transparency. What do you mean by non-discrimination? Non-discrimination implies that every nation, every member country will treat the other country as most favored nation. If you are most favored to me, then I must also be most favored to you. That means the mutual cooperation should be there. We should consider both of us as favored nations. Okay? And reciprocity means if I reduce tariff, okay, for giving you market access in my market, then I can expect that you must also reciprocate. That means you must also reduce import tariffs so that I can have an access in your market. This is called reciprocity. And what is transparency? Transparency means there should not be any hidden barrier in the form of non-tariff barrier, in the form of subsidy support, in the form of any non-market support to the producers. Okay? Now, what are the arguments for multilateralism, multilateral trade? How multilateral trade can benefit all the countries throughout the globe? The first point is specialization on the basis of comparative cost advantage and gains from production. We know from the theory, international trade theory, what is comparative cost advantage? If a country can produce a commodity at a lower opportunity cost compared to the other, then according to Ricardo, that country should specialize in that line of production. Even in Heckscher-Ohlin theorem of international trade, what we have observed, a country should specialize in that line of production where the commodity is intensive in the use of the most abundant factor of that particular country. For example, if a capital-rich country should produce more capital-intensive product. A labor-rich country should specialize in that line of production where the products are labor-intensive. So that is the flavor of comparative cost advantage. So if you can produce a commodity with lower cost, I can produce another commodity at a lower cost, and if we exchange it without any barrier, then both of us will gain from trade. And that is the flavor of gains from trade and the gain from multilateralism. If we can export more, okay, we are specialized, then we create market for your product and you create market for my product. So this mutual exchange will create a win-win game, and our national income will rise, our savings will rise, our investment will rise, we can create more employment, okay, job opportunities within the country, and thereby multilateralism can help our growth process. Now here I have used one diagram, very simple diagram to analyze what I have already told. Here in this diagram, in one, say in the horizontal axis, I have taken X commodity, the vertical axis I have taken Y commodity. And this TT1 line shows production possibility frontier. The equation is PPF, production possibility frontier, is a function of L is the total resource. For example, labor resource of the country is a function of two commodities X and Y. That means given the resource and technology of a country, what different combinations of two commodities X and Y that the country can produce. So this is the frontier. A country with its given resource cannot move beyond this frontier, and the shape is concave in the sense that if you increase more and more the output of X, then you have to sacrifice more and more of Y. It implies increasing opportunity cost of X. Similarly, SIC is showing the social indifference curve. I think you have an idea of indifference curve. Indifference curve also shows here the function is U. U means utility. Social utility is a function of different combinations of X and Y. That means different combinations of X and Y will give rise to a given level of utility. So social indifference curve will show a given level of utility. And this is the income line. Income line means total revenue generated, total value of output. You can consider it as the national income, national output, value of national output. The value of X, Px is the price of X multiplied by the X that you produce. Py is the price of Y per unit multiplied by Y that you produce. So the total value is the total value of your output of the country. And this line is a linear line. You can express it in this way. If you divide both the sides by Py, what you get? You get Y equals to R by Py minus Px by Py into X. So if you differentiate Y with respect to X, what you get? dy dx will then be minus Px by Py, where you assume that Px is constant, Py is also constant. So the slope of the price line, that is PD here, which is considered to be the domestic price line. Here, please see PD. We have a given slope, linear. And then at the touch point, if it touches the production possibility frontier, the absolute slope of the production possibility frontier is called as marginal rate of transformation, MRT of X for Y, and which, if you differentiate this function totally, you get this proportion, marginal cost of X divided by marginal cost of Y. So this is called as relative marginal cost of X. So at equilibrium point, you must produce that combination of X and Y where Px by Py, that is the slope of the price line, must be equal to Mcx by Mcy. That is the equilibrium. Okay, I am not going into the details of that equilibrium. This is a part of micro. And what amount you should consume? You must consume that combination of X and Y where the relative price of Y is just equal to the marginal rate of substitution of X for Y. What is MRS? MRS is the absolute slope of the social indifference curve, which is actually marginal utility of X divided by marginal utility of Y. So therefore, if you consider before trade, the production and consumption point was at A. That was before trade under autarky. And as you open up, you face an international price line steeper. Please see, PI is the international price line. So you shift your production from A to B. Now you are producing more of X. So you are specializing. And you are consuming at point E. What is the speciality of it? Now you are moving beyond your production frontier, production possibility frontier. That means through trade, okay, you can create a possibility, consumption possibility much higher than the production possibility. So that leads to higher utility level. If you think of one SIC touching point A, that should be lower than SIC, this SIC. So according to that rule, higher the SIC, higher will be the level of utility. So through trade, it is possible that the country can efficiently utilize its resources. If it moves from point M to A or M to B, it means proper utilization of resource. And if it can move beyond point A, that will add to their utility, that will add to the total welfare of the country. In this way, multilateralism is good for an economy. Now, it creates expanded market for any less developed economy, okay, particularly for low-income country. It creates market, okay, for their own commodities, and the subsistence sector in the less developed economy can be much more monetized. Okay, they can subsistence sector means a sector where they produce only for domestic consumption. So through trade, they can be they can sell their product for the market, and foreign capital will be available much more after trade. Okay, the foreign capital may flow, and normally a less developed country suffers from the dearth of capital. So then their growth is not constrained by capital flow, domestic capital, because they will get enough capital from abroad. the linkage effect of the export sector will also work. There are two types of linkage. One is backward linkage, the other is forward linkage. If any sector is developed, export sector develops, then it creates investment opportunities in the succeeding stages of production. That is called forward linkage. For example, if cotton textile industry develops, then garment industry will develop. This is called forward linkage. If cotton textile industry develops, then cotton, farmers, cotton growers, they will get an incentive. This is called backward linkage. So if investment in any sector, export sector, creates investment opportunity in the preceding stages of production, that is called as backward linkage effect. So this linkage effect will create more opportunities for the small developing countries. And IMF and World Bank, all of them, they are of the opinion that through this trade, poverty can be reduced, and it has been proved that throughout the globe over the last few decades, the incidence of poverty and multidimensional poverty, it has been reducing. Okay. Now, we have discussed different problems arising out of globalization. Okay. Now, can you tell me any reason where the process of globalization can intensify the problem of poverty, particularly in less developed and developing countries? And the possibility of attaining, industrialization through trade and higher factor productivity. If you are involved in trade, then, for example, you are a less developed economy, you are exporting your primary products, you can import some inputs, some improved varieties of machines, etc., so that you can develop your own industries, okay, some other sectors, so that you can have that possibility of industrialization through trade, and you can eliminate some of your deficiencies in the growth process, okay, and you can create a virtuous circle of growth. So when you are attaining higher growth rate, okay, then your objective will be to attain higher and still higher growth rate. So growth begets growth. If you have enough income, you can save more, you can invest more, and hence you can attain further growth. That is called a virtuous circle of growth. And through trade, you can also check the monopoly power. If you can create through multilateral trade, you can create a competitive environment, then the monopoly power can be checked. And we can show that monopoly is not good for the economy, and efficiency can be judged. If you have a competitive environment, I have used this diagram. Here you have considering the demand curve, the supply curve, and a competitive price which is being determined through the market forces of supply and demand. PC shows competitive price and QC shows competitive quantity. Okay, and how you can judge the efficiency? What is consumer surplus? Consumer surplus, that notion, I think you know, what you are willing to pay and what you are actually paying. For any particular quantity, the demand curve shows that what you are actually willing to pay and what you are actually paying, that distance is consumer surplus. So total consumer surplus will be equal to area A plus B plus C when there is a competition in the economy. And what is producer surplus? Producer surplus is what you are getting and what you expect to get. Every point on the marginal, on the supply curve indicates the marginal cost. So that is the minimum expected price by any seller. And that area, F plus G plus H, would show the producer surplus. So under competitive environment, your consumer surplus plus producer surplus is maximum. That shows the efficiency. But if that competitive environment is replaced by the monopoly, then the monopoly price is PM, consumer surplus will be reduced, producer surplus will be reduced. So through multilateralism, if you can create an environment of competition within the economy, then you can attain higher efficiency. Okay. It has been shown that even if you have monopolistic competition within an environment of multilateral trade, then also you can attain efficiency, because if all the monopolists, they fix the price following a markup over marginal cost, a constant markup. For example, marginal cost is there and all of them just fixing the price 10% above the marginal cost. So in that case, the price relative price of a commodity will be equal to the relative marginal cost of the commodity, and then also it will indicate an efficiency. Okay, and what we have observed, some of the limitations is with the growth in the number of members of GATT and WTO during 1948 to 2000, say huge number of increase in the number of members. And what we observe that when there are so many members in an organization, then it becomes progressively difficult to conclude new multilateral agreement because they have different interest. Okay, and the small countries, okay, they find that their importance is now less because they are losing their bargaining strength. So with the enlargement of the members, if the small country, they believe that their demands are not being protected by the large economies, then they want a separate sort of organization. And hence, this is the starting point of deviation from the multilateralism. And we find the starting point of regionalism, regional trade agreement, or preferential trade agreement. Okay, for example, NAFTA, for example, European Union, for example, SAARC, which we shall discuss in our next module. So from this discussion, what we get the need for multilateralism, and we get the emphasis points of GATT and WTO for multilateral trade, and the gradual reduction in tariff and non-tariff barriers by different countries, and adoption of the principles of non-discrimination, reciprocity, and transparency, which are the basic pillars of multilateral trade, and some benefits out of multilateral trade, and what are some of the limitations of multilateral trade policies. Thank you very much for attending this module, this course. Thank you.